been a controversy since before the days of the Great Monkey Trial. And now, George Mason University presents Creation versus Evolution with Dr. Duane T. Gish and Dr. Michael G. Emsley.
Today's debate is not merely a debate on the general subject of creation and evolution, but a formal debate question or resolution which has been agreed to by both debaters. And this question is, the theory of evolution is superior to the theory of special creation as an explanation for the scientific evidence related to origins. The format agreed to by the parties is that each debater will get exactly 45 minutes for opening arguments. After that, there will be a very short break for all of us, followed by 2 rounds of a rebuttal of exactly 10 minutes and 5 minutes in turn. This will be followed by approximately 30 minutes for questions from the audience. So the break time that we will have afterwards will be detracted somewhat from your question time, so the promptness in returning will give us more time for questions. Be forewarned that I will permit questions only and not speeches. So if you want to ask a question, be prepared to have them in that format. Because the formal question is stated in the terms of the superiority of evolution, the debater taking that side has the burden of proof and consequently is entitled by the rules of debate to go first. I will now introduce each of the debaters. Dr. Mike Emsley has a PhD from the Imperial College of Science and Technology at the University of London. He is currently a professor of biology at George Mason University and has been the chairman of the Department of Entomology at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. He's also been the chairman of the Department of Biology at George Mason University and a professor of biology for a number of years. He has published a number of articles and books on the description of new species of insects in tropical biology. He will be taking the side of evolution. Dr. Duane T. Gish has a PhD in biochemistry from the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Gish spent 18 years in biochemical and biomedical research at Cornell University Medical College, the Virus Laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley, and the Upjohn Company in Kalamazoo, Michigan. He is the author or co-author of numerous technical articles in his field and is recognized by many evolutionists as the leading spokesman for creation science in America today. With that introduction, the debate will begin with Dr. Emsley taking the affirmative position on the question previously stated.
Thank you, Moderator Farris. Thank you, Moderator Farris. Is the sound all right? Because from here, can you hear me? Can we turn the sound up at all? Is that any better? Is it good enough? Creationist Gish. I suppose I was about 11 years old when a school friend of mine, Harrison II, he was called Harrison II not because of a long lineage of Harrisons, but he had an elder brother at the school who was called Harrison I. And Harrison II came to me one day very secretively and almost whispered in my ear, "Come home with me. I've got a book concealed from my parents under my bed that I think you would like to see." What was it about? Evolution. Well, I knew evolution had something to do with sex, so immediately I was absolutely fascinated. And after all, it might even have pictures. Well, it did. It had just one picture. A picture of a giraffe reaching up for some leaves at the top of the tree. Sorry, getting feedback. The caption, I thought, was absolutely stupid. It said, "Why does a giraffe have such a long neck?" Well, any schoolboy knows the answer to that. It's because its head's so far from its body. And that is rather like saying, my dog has got legs so short they only just touch the ground. It was some years before I realized the real reason why a giraffe has a long neck. And it was about the same time that I realized that I realized that this thing called the scientific method, which a lot of students think is very, very complicated and really not for them, boils down to what you and I would call common sense. We use it every day. If my car won't start, I make a hypothesis. There is a blockage in the fuel system. I check the fuel pump. I check the gas lines. I check the jets in the carburetor. I'm still in the old days of carburetors. Everything appears to be all right. My hypothesis was wrong. So I make a new one. It's to do with the electrical system. So I check the high tension leads, and I find that the high tension lead from the coil has come out. I now know that was the cause of the fault. My hypothesis was correct. Now, not all scientific problems are as simple and perhaps oversimple as that, but the basic argument is the same. That you see a set of data, you see a phenomenon or a situation, and you want to explain it. So you start out with an educated guess. You say no more than, well, let's suppose it's like this. And then you make a prediction that if indeed it is like that, then certain events should follow. In the field that my honourable opponent is in, he would perform an experiment. In other fields, for instance in geology, you would make further observations to confirm or refute your hypothesis. In science, every suggestion that you put forward must be capable of being falsified. And so you say, if this is true, then that is true. And if that turns out to be untrue, then your hypothesis is wrong. Now, many people say, and you may hear it this afternoon, that evolution cannot be falsified because you cannot repeat it. Well, you certainly can't repeat it, but if evolution is true, there is a whole suite of other events and other conditions which should also be true. And so you can argue, if evolution is true, then the following predictions can be made. And I will present to you some of the predictions which would be true if evolution has taken place. And I point out to you that any discussion of evolution can be divided into two parts. Firstly, has it actually taken place? This essentially is what's on the table today. But then there is the other component, which occupies the scientific community much more. How has it taken place? And when you read in the Washington Post, or you read in any of the more popular magazines, that Darwinism is dead, that Stephen Jay Gould has said this or that or the other, none of these people are arguing whether evolution has taken place. They are purely debating how. I don't think there's a real mainstream biologist in the land who does not agree that evolution has taken place. The debate they would have would be how. And there certainly are some unexplained phenomena, and we are going to take, I'm sure, quite some time before we can really sit back and feel complacent and say, check, we have done it. Now, some of you may feel that anything called a theory is just some sort of gobbledygook type thing that someone's dreamed up and it has no substance. In science, that isn't true. The scientist proposes a hypothesis and tests it, and tests it, and tests it. If the tests are negative, he either abandons, and I should say he or she, either abandons the hypothesis or modifies it to accommodate these denials. If after many, many tests the hypothesis is still holding up, in a way you can say it graduates. It becomes a theory. The theory of evolution is so well-founded it can take its place beside atomic theory or any of the major theories of physics. Just because it's called a theory, don't think that it doesn't have a real solid foundation of evidence. You might ask now, what is evolution? What does he mean by that? Well, of course, you can look up textbooks and you can find a whole variety of definitions, but there's only one really that is common to them all, and that is this: that life over the life of the earth and the life that life has been upon it has been subject to change, such that all organisms currently living are related, albeit in some cases rather distantly, by genetic continuity. If you had the perspicacity, if you could see back into the past, we think you could see the origin of not only man, but the origin of every one of the estimated 30 million species living on this earth. You may think that's a fanciful number. Terry Irwin from the Smithsonian has been collecting insects in the tropical rainforests of Bolivia, the Amazon basin, Peru, and from his captures and his rate of discovery of new insects, he estimates that the 1.5 million species of all organism that we know today, half of which are insects, that number will rise to 30 million if we could in fact catch them all, identify them all, before the rainforests are destroyed by man, which will happen of course in the next 25, 30 years. So we'll never know how many species there are, but there may well be something of that magnitude. If we could understand and look back, we would see connections between all organisms back to maybe either a single or possibly a dual common origin. What is the evidence? Much of it you know already. If evolution has taken place, then we should see evidence of past organisms. Well, we do. Fossils have been known to be fossilized organisms ever since Aristotelian times. Secondly, if evolution has taken place, then those fossils we find should be different from the organisms currently living. They are. Only got to cite dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are all now extinct. They are different from anything that is alive today. Thirdly, if evolution has taken place, then the older you go back in time, the more different the organisms should become. So if you look at fossils only a few centuries old, they should look like modern forms. If you go back 1 million years, they should look a little different. If you go back 100 million years, they should look quite different. And indeed, they do. If you go back 60 million years, you find only 3% of the organisms that you can find have any real similarity to anything we know today. And go back 200 million years, and that 3% is 0. So that is true. If evolution's taken place, we should be able to see in the fossil record transitional forms between species and between major groups, from amphibians to reptiles, from fish to amphibians, from reptiles to birds, from reptiles to mammals. We should be able to see some evidence of the rate at which change has taken place and the intermediate forms. And we do. Now, of course, my opponent here will point out that there are some embarrassing gaps, and we will come to those when he identifies them. Fifthly, that the material of which all organisms are made should be alike. We should all be made of the same stuff. Well, those of you who are interested in retaining your svelte figures have read the dietetic handbooks, and you know perfectly well that the stuff we eat, which is all living or recently living material, is composed of carbohydrate, protein, lipid, oils and fats, and nucleic acids, which we don't talk much about in dietary, the stuff that DNA is made of. We're all made of the same basic chemical compounds, but it goes more than that. Take one example, protein. Now, those of you who have any chemical background know that proteins are made like a string of boxcars out of amino acids. If you make amino acids in the ChemiLab, as I'm sure my opponent has done or seen done, there is a huge array of amino acids you can make. If you take carbonaceous chondrites, which are meteorites containing carbon, which we presume have been whirtling around in the solar system and then have been caught by our gravitational field, and in they come, and those that don't get burnt up strike the Earth, and we can find them. If we analyze them, many of them contain amino acids. A huge array. I think I saw the figure 300 different kinds once. But you and I are made of just 20. The bacteria, which I don't like to tell you, are living in your gut, have just 20. The same 20. No matter what organisms you look at on Earth, with rare exceptions, the same 20 amino acids, and only those 20 go to make up your protein. Sometime in the past, there has to have been some kind of selection process in which living material chose, or had chosen for it, I should say, to be more accurate, these 20 and no others. We do not know what that process was, nor do we really know even how to begin to address that question. There are some speculative guesses, but we don't really know. But it goes even finer than that. I don't want to bore you with chemical details. But an amino acid has a fairly complex three-dimensional structure. We can draw it in a chemistry book as if it's been flattened by a road roller, but it really has a solid shape. And each amino acid, each one of our 20, comes with a mirror image configuration that, if you look at them, they're made of the same atoms, but they are arranged in a mirror image arrangement. If you make a solution of this kind and pass a beam of light through it, which has been screened so that all the little photons of light are vibrating in one direction only, the plane of direction of vibration will be rotated to the left with this form of the amino acid and rotated to the right with this. We call them, colloquially, left-handed and right-handed forms. Every single one of the 20 amino acids of which we are all made are left-handed. There seems no real chemical reason why that should be so, but they are. We would surmise that at some time in the past, when these 20 were selected, there was some reason why the left-handed form was preferred over the right, and the right was abandoned. You may have read recently that one way, perhaps, of enjoying cream pies without putting on weight is to use a special kind of sugar. Sugars, like amino acids, come in left-handed and right-handed forms. Our bodies, and the bodies of all living organisms on Earth, use only right-handed sugars. We have no ability to deal with the left-handed ones. And somebody had the bright idea, wow, you could eat pies until you popped just by using left-handed sugars, which we cannot digest, and therefore you would get no nourishment out of it. You would get the sensation without the penalty. I don't recommend it, because putting sugars into your alimentary canal, even though they remain undigested, do all sorts of nasty things to the water relations, and you would spend a great deal of time in what in our house is called the library. That's because that's where we keep all our magazines, and my wife is absolutely amazed at how many magazines I read. We come then to the stuff that genes are made of, the genetic code. We know a lot about it now. 20 years ago, we didn't know nearly so much. Some of you who might be diabetic and who are on insulin could be using insulin made by a bacterium, dictated to it by a man-made gene. We know so much about genes, we can make a gene artificially, put it into a bacterial cell, and the bacterial cell will crank out insulin, growth hormone, whatever you call it up. So we really understand how genes work. The code for making insulin or growth hormone or whatever it is the same code in bacteria, mice, and women. Oh, sorry, men. They're all the same. the genetic code has gone uniformly from wherever life began, because once you've got a coding system, once you have a cipher, to change it means chaos. And so we got locked in, we, living organisms, got locked in to a particular coding system whenever life began, which I would surmise was somewhere around probably 4 billion years ago. And once having got locked into it, we've been stuck with it, and here it is pervading all organisms on Earth. So we are made of the same stuff. Now, if we had independent origins, there would be no necessity for us to have this commonality in our construction. One species could be made one way, another species could be made another. The only rational interpretation of this uniformity in design is that there has been continuity through all the organisms that have this commonality. Another thing you can point to. We are called Homo sapiens. The specific name, sapiens, I guess you can question. It means wise. Linnaeus gave us that name somewhere in the middle 1700s, at a time that he thought we really were wise. He gave us the foundation of our classificatory system. Now, Linnaeus was a creationist. He had absolutely no knowledge of evolution. It hadn't been discussed at that time, and he brought about a classification system in which he built up the phyla, the orders, families, genera, species, which in essence is still with us today. Now, he could do that because what we see before us is a natural classification. All the organisms on Earth, from bacteria to man, if indeed that are the extremities, are really the twigs of a tree, a very, very branched tree. And so when you take a little cluster of twiglets, they have come from a principal stem. That stem has come from other stems and down ultimately to the trunk. So when you build up a classificatory system, it should reflect the natural relationships between the organisms, not only those alive today, but also those that are extinct. If our classification system is right, and if evolution's taken place, then looking at today's organisms should bring about a classification system that is absolutely as appropriate to the extinct ones as well. And it is. All the extinct and living organisms form part of the same classification system. So once again, we propose that if evolution is true, a natural classification system could be devised. And it is. So far, everything looks right. Let us come now to actual structure of cells themselves. We're all made of cells. We've known that ever since 1838 and 1839, when Schleiden and Swan brought out what was called, I think erroneously, cell theory. Now, it isn't really a theory, it's just a description. All cells with nuclei have the same fundamental arrangement. They have a cell membrane on the outside, which is made up of a phospholipid sandwich of uniform construction throughout all living tissue. Inside is what we call the cytoplasm. That has in it a number of things, like the powerhouse of a cell, the mitochondria. With a rare exception, all mitochondria are thereabouts the same. It has little packets of things for doing digestive work, lysosomes, they're uniform. It has ribosomes for translating genes, they're all the same. It has the nucleus with the chromosomes, the actual substance of chromosomes is the same. The only thing that really differs are the genes along their length. When cells come to divide, they go through a gymnastics display of chromosomes, and the gymnastics display is the same in all the cells we've ever seen that have a nucleus. And so, once again, we find this uniformity, as if there was a common cell design, and we have all retained it up to the present day. When you look at a group of animals like the vertebrates, which are known to us, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, then you can look at a group like the vertebrates and say, if evolution's taken place, then these organisms should have some uniformity in their construction. if the house lights could go down, and if somebody would just turn on from where you stand, that's right, the left-hand projector. If this works, I should be able to bring up the first slide. I can, good. Dr. Gish has kindly lent me his high-tech pointer. This is a laser light. Look at that, very nice. If it isn't sharp, now the people at the back, I'm sorry, but one of the penalties of coming in a little bit late is that you can't see the pictures. And we thought of taking the projector back to get a bigger picture, but then the intensity goes down, and we decided that it was better to give the people at the front a good picture and the people at the back no picture than give everybody a lousy picture. This picture in the middle is the limb of a fossil amphibian, the limb that we first find having a five-fingered, five-toed configuration on Earth. And the limbs around, which are human, lizard, whale, cat, excuse me, I can't read from here, cat, horse, frog, bird, and bat, are all built on the same plan. That there is, as we have, a humerus, a radius and ulna, a femur, a tibia and fibula, and the same number, basically, of digits and the bones of the wrist and the ankle. It doesn't matter whether the animal flies, walks, runs, swims, the basic construction is the same. The only difference is fusion of bones, such as in the bird, the fingers and the wrist bones are fused to some extent, and there has been loss. There's only 1, 2, 3 digits. Whereas in the bat, the digits have become highly elongate to support the membrane with which they fly. If vertebrates had no evolutionary relationship, why would their limbs be built with such a common design? You could surely build a better bat wing and a better whale fin if you started from scratch and had an absolutely clean piece of paper, but these animals didn't have a clean piece of paper. They had to make the best they could with something that looked a bit like that. If one looks at development, this picture on the left, and those of you who are close will see that these are dotted as well as solid, and then these are solid only. The dotted lines represent the blood vessels of a fish. There are 6 pairs. A larval amphibian has 6 pairs just like an adult fish. But then when it metamorphoses into a frog or a toad or whatever adult it is, it loses those, and retains the rest. And so the cross-hatched blood system is what the adult frog possesses. When you come to an animal like the one on the right, which is a mammal, you and I start out with 6 blood vessels just like a fish. The only difference is we don't have them all at once. They appear sequentially, and by the time the last one's appeared, the first one's gone. So it's not true to say we have 6 blood vessels like a fish, but they are represented in the course of our development. Look at the similarity between the picture on the right and the picture on the left. The only real difference is that the mammal has this one vessel coming round, taking blood to the posterior part of the body, whereas the amphibian has that one, plus one the other side. The only thing that's happened here is that that one has been lost. And so a mammal has a dorsal aorta which comes out on the left-hand side of the heart. We think that mammals came from one reptilian stock and birds came from another. The bird picture is identical to that, except that that vessel is absent and that one is present. The bird has a mirror image blood system to that of the mammal. Now, why would this be so unless there was some historical connection between the amphibians and the mammals and the amphibians and the birds? Well, if evolution is true, that is what you would expect. Look at the development of the kidney. In the upper picture, these two, we have a lamprey, which is a jawless fish, which represents a very, very ancient kind of fish. We have jawless fish going back 500 million years. In fact, the earliest fish were jawless. And I don't have any pictures to show you, but it's interesting to notice that these earliest fish were jawless and had a large number of gill slits. After 100 million years, we find the appearance of jawed fish with a smaller number of gill slits. And the pieces of skeleton that separate the gill slits that would be at the front form the upper and lower jaw. And even in fish development, the same thing happens, that the little cartilaginous bars that you would expect in a jawless fish to stay where they are, in a jawed fish migrate to form the upper and the lower jaw. And there's no reason why that should happen unless there is some historical basis for it. Back to the picture. This little symbol here represents an embryonic kidney. It's called the pronephros, pro meaning first, nephros, kidney. And that will suffice to work in the embryo of, shall we say, an amphibian like a frog. Then, when it becomes adult, a second kidney actually takes over and does the adult blood cleansing. I wonder if you could sharpen the bottom. Thank you. In reptiles, birds and mammals, in the early embryo, you get the anterior kidney, which is the functional one in the embryonic frog. Then you get the middle kidney, which is the functional one in the adult frog. And then you get a third kidney, a new one, and these two are abandoned. Those of you who are male might like to know that this kidney here ends up in your genital region, and it's called the epididymis. If there is no evolutionary basis, why would a reptile, a bird, or a mammal go through this complicated procedure just to produce a kidney? It has to do it that way because that's the way that evolution has ordained it. It is a captive of its past. So, once again, I find that this piece of development supports evolution. Now, this picture is ancient, 1902. And a man called Haeckel, a German, in the 1880s, put forward an idea which has been debunked to a very large extent. He said, and using his own terminology, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. What does that mean? Ontogeny is the development of the individual. Phylogeny is the development of the group to which that individual belongs. So in our case, vertebrates. What Haeckel said was that if you look at these embryos, and here is a pig, hog in this country, a calf, a rabbit, a man. If you look at the embryos, he said, incorrectly, that the embryo of a man will go through the fish stage, the amphibian stage, the reptile stage, and then the mammalian stage. What he forgot, or just didn't think about, was that embryos themselves have to undergo evolution to accommodate the changes to get to the adult form that they are destined to achieve. And there isn't time or the ability to go through an adult fish, an adult amphibian, an adult reptile stage. But what the embryos do is recapture the embryonic fish, the embryonic amphibian, the embryonic reptile stage. And so when you look at early embryos, like these here, they are virtually indistinguishable. But as they develop, they get more and more different. You might notice that here is the human, 1, 2, 3. We did indeed have a tail during our embryological stage. We don't have one now. Why would we have one as an embryo? I leave that as an open question. And if you examine the embryo in this region here, you will find no gill slits we don't have fish-like gill slits because only adult fish have gill slits. What we do have are little grooves where gill slits would be, and these grooves appear and then disappear. Now, maybe it's coincidence, but I would put it to you that no, it is really a mark of our heritage. Now, modern techniques have opened up a whole field of evidence that hitherto has been unavailable. This chart here, you can ignore the one over the top, and I'll read the numbers for those of you who are too far back. Every biology student, and there are a lot of them here today, have been called upon to memorize the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system, and it's the bane of their life. One of the enzymes that they encounter is cytochrome C. Cytochrome C occurs in every organism that utilizes oxygen in the course of respiration. And those organisms are from bacteria through all the plants, fungi, animals, to man. We have the capability now of analyzing cytochrome C, and we find it's made of 104 of these little amino acid boxcars. Now, if evolution is true, and we are closely related to, shall we say, a chimpanzee, then we should find that the structure of cytochrome C is more similar in a man and a chimpanzee than, shall we say, in man and a rabbit or a cow or a kangaroo or any other animal you like to choose. When we analyze these amino acids, what do we find? Man versus chimpanzee, 0. All 104 are the same. Rhesus monkey, 1 different. Rabbit, 9. Cow, 10. Kangaroo, 10. Duck, 11. Pigeon, 12. Rattlesnake, 14. Bullfrog, 18. Tuna, 20. Fruit fly, 24. Moth, 26. Wheat germ, 37. Mold, 40. Baker's yeast, 42. The further you get away, the bigger the number of differences. Now, they're all doing the same thing. Why should that be so? If evolution is true, this is what you would expect. Let's try a display which perhaps is easier to grasp. This is the same information portrayed. Here's man, and these organisms going from right to left are in increasing level of difference. Well, there's a primate. Here is presumably, I can't read it, looks like a goat actually, and rabbit, a kangaroo, and the same animals are displayed here, ending up with a fly, moth, wheat germ, fungus, etc. And so we find, and these lines show the actual relationships in a more precise way. Let's try a different protein. Hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is, as you know, the molecule responsible for transporting oxygen around your body. It's made up of 4 of these strings of boxcars. 2 of them are identical, called the alpha chains. 2 are identical, called the beta chains, and they all fit together like a jigsaw puzzle to make a nice round molecule that can transport oxygen. The beta chain has been analyzed here. It has 146 amino acids, and if evolution is true, we should find that the difference in these 146 between man and those that empirically are closely related, like primates, there should be fewer differences than animals that are obviously more different, like horses, cows, sheep, and so forth. What do we find? Here is human versus human, of course, the same animal, nothing. Gorilla, 1. Gibbon, 2. Monkey, 8. Dog, 15. Horse, cow, 25. Mouse, 27. Grey kangaroo, 38. Chicken, 45. Frog, amphibian, 67. Lamprey, 125. And sea slug, 127. Again, you couldn't have predicted the numbers, but you could predict the trend. The trend is going absolutely down the line towards supporting our hypothesis. This is the DNA itself. If you take the fertilized egg of a horse and the fertilized egg of a human, from a biological point of view, the only difference is in the genes and maybe a little bit of cytoplasmic difference. they would look virtually identical. We have new techniques which enable us to unzipper the genes and then match up DNA from one organism with DNA from another. If we take human DNA and match it against chimpanzee, we find 2.5% of the gene is different. If we match it against gibbon, we find 5% is different. Against Old World monkeys, 9%. New World monkeys, 15. Lemurs, a very primitive primate, 42. Mouse and rat, rodent, 30. And fruit flies, 75% difference. Again, that is exactly what you would expect. And so the trend supports the hypothesis that evolution has in fact taken place. Now this last piece is a bit complicated and I have purposely oversimplified it. I'm not sure whether Ed Max is in the audience. He said he would try and get here. He works at NIH and he drew my attention to something that I knew nothing about. But I find this very, very persuasive. And I may tell some half-truths from a strictly biochemical point of view, and maybe Dr. Gish will straighten me out. But I'm not telling anything untrue in principle. I just don't want to have to explain to you exactly what these mutations are. This gene here, represented by the black rectangle, is a gene that we all have, and it helps us deal with allergies. It's called the epsilon gene, and it produces antibodies. All of us in this room possess this gene, as do a whole range of other mammals. One of the strange things about mammalian genes is that for some reason that we don't really understand, many of them have become duplicated. We possess many copies of some genes. Only one copy is ever made to work. The others lie there silent, never expressed, or maybe to be more correct, very rarely expressed. Now, if you go through generations after generations after generations of reproduction, genes which are expressed, if they mutate, the mutations are going to be manifest in some way, and you're going to notice it. But if you've got genes which are never expressed, mutations in those genes you'll be absolutely unaware of, because they are never turned on. We find in many mammals that this normal gene is accompanied by a mutated gene. So you have that and that. This one is not expressed. And so hitherto we have been totally unaware of it. But when we do DNA hybridization and DNA analysis, this gene has come to light. This one here is another mutation, and for those of you who are into this kind of thing, they don't understand how this mutation has occurred. What has happened is that this gene has been transcribed into messenger RNA with a poly-A tail, and then with a an enzyme-like reverse transcriptase, that poly-A tailed RNA has been converted back into DNA with a poly-T tail and put back into the chromosome. So it's a very strange kind of mutation. But as it isn't expressed, the organism doesn't care. Now we have then the normal gene, the classical mutation, and the processed mutation. The next slide shows where these occur. If we go up the time scale, I'm not sure whether that's as sharp as it could be, probably is. Here's 80 million years ago, and here is the stem from which, if not all, most mammals evolved. Up this line here to a rat, and up that line there to a rabbit, these mutations, this duplication of this gene did not take place. So they have only the regular epsilon gene and nothing else. Time went by, and this line here, at about maybe 30 or so million years ago, split and gave rise to monkeys and apes and man. Prior to that split, this mutation took place, this funny one. And so we find that in that organism, that organism, that, and that. All these have that silent, extraordinarily complicated mutation. Time goes by till you get to about here, 20 plus million years ago, when we believe the apes began to really diversify. The second mutation took place, and it occurs in that one, the gorilla, and man. We alone, of the organisms tested, have this classical pseudogene. All those have this, and those have neither. Now, information of this kind is coming up annually, and it always conforms to a pattern that if evolution has taken place, then you would expect mutations that have occurred late to only be in a small number of species, whereas those that have taken place early would be in a large number. And you should be able to draw a diagram like that and just rationally figure out how it has got the distribution you observe. There is no other really rational explanation for this distribution except that evolution has in fact taken place. That's the end of this bank of slides. I haven't quite finished. What I do need, though, is a small drink of water. Maybe Dr. Gish is used to looking into bright lights. I like to see the whites of the audience's eyes, and I'm afraid I'm just sort of looking into space, but I have to put up with that. The last thing is this, that if evolution has taken place, and we have indeed gone from some very simple single cell to 30 million species of organism on Earth, then the world has to be very old. And radioactive dating, radiometric dating, which is accepted by physicists and geologists throughout the land, has told us that the age of the Earth is approximately 4.6 billion years. And that number is very, very different from the number that many of you have in your minds. And I was given a signal saying I have 1 minute, and that 1 minute must be very nearly up, so I will stop at that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ferris, Dr. Emsley. Ladies and gentlemen, certainly I am pleased to have this opportunity to be here this afternoon and to tell you about some of the research, the results of my research on the subject of origins, which has convinced me as a scientist that the theory of evolution is scientifically untenable, that the universe could not have created itself naturally, and that life could not have arisen spontaneously on this planet. Furthermore, I want to describe some aspects of the historical record, that is the fossil record, which shows indeed that living organisms have not evolved. I certainly want to express my appreciation to Dr. Emsley for his very fine presentation. Certainly many of the things that he has said, if evolution is true, it is possible to interpret the data in the way that he has described this afternoon. But I want to bring up to your attention this afternoon many contradictions to these standard interpretations. I found Dr. Emsley to be a very fine gentleman, and I know our time together is going to be a very enjoyable one, and while we may disagree, we'll just simply agree to disagree and have a good time at it. Let me mention the fact that it is not only the creation scientists who are questioning evolution theory today, but many evolutionists. That may sound strange, but what they are doing is challenging the explanation that we have been exposed to in our academic training from Darwin and from the neo-Darwinian explanation and others. Many of these are still evolutionists. They haven't become creationists. But what they are saying that many of these standard explanations must be wrong, and they're looking for some new explanations. I have, for example, an article published in Newsweek, April 8, 1985, on page 80 by Sharon Begley. And she starts her article out this way. She says, "The great body of work deriving from Charles Darwin's revolutionary 1859 book on the origin of species is under increasing attack, and not just from creationists. Richard Lewontin of Harvard, a biologist of impeccably secular views, accuses Darwinists of telling, quote, just so, unquote, stories when they try to show how natural selection explains such novelties as long-necked giraffe," end of quote. Then later on, she's talking about some of these other controversies, and she says this: "So heated is the debate that one Darwinian says there are times when he thinks about going into a field with more intellectual honesty, the used car business." Now, ladies and gentlemen, please, I didn't say that, and I wouldn't say that. It wasn't a creationist who said that, but it was an evolutionist. Now, I have a book here with me called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, written by a British scientist, Dr. Michael Denton. He has an MD degree and a PhD degree. His PhD, I believe, is from either Reading or Birmingham, and so he's a molecular biologist. He is now in Australia in genetic engineering research. He makes no profession of being a Christian, a believer of any kind, or of being a creationist. But his book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, which is available from Harper and Row, by the way, is a devastating critique of evolution theory. On every count, according to Dr. Denton, evolution strikes out. He doesn't have any prejudice or bias towards my point of view, but this is his analysis of the evidence. The jacket of the book says, for example, "The theory of evolution, as propounded by Darwin and elaborated into accepted fact, quote unquote, by biologists, is in serious trouble. This sober, authoritative, and responsible book by a practicing scientist presents an accurate account of the rapidly accumulating evidence which threatens to destroy almost every cherished tenet of Darwinian evolution." And then a little later it says, "Not only has paleontology failed spectacularly to come up with the fossil missing links which Darwin anticipated, but hypothetical reconstructions of major evolutionary developments, such as that linking birds to reptiles, are beginning to look more and more like science fiction fantasies than serious conjectures." Later on we read, most important of all, the discoveries of molecular biologists, of whom Michael Denton is one, far from strengthening Darwinian claims, are throwing more and more doubt upon the correctness of the whole theory. End of quote. And I'll describe some of that evidence later. And so we see that indeed evolution theory is in very serious trouble today. I want to describe some of the reasons why. Now, may we have the first slide, please? We need someone with, yes, turn on the projector for us. Now, I want to have an evolutionist describe the theory of evolution for us. This is a description of the theory by Sir Julian Huxley, the British biologist and evolutionist. This is what Huxley had to say. He said, "Evolution in the extended sense can be defined as a directional and essentially irreversible process occurring in time, which in its course gives rise to an increase of variety and an increasingly high level of organization in its products. Our present knowledge indeed forces us to the view that the whole of reality is evolution, a single process of self-transformation." End of quote. Therefore, according to Huxley and many of his evolutionary colleagues, evolution is a process of self-transformation. Evolution is an attempt, the theory of evolution is an attempt to explain by means of naturalistic, mechanistic processes which are due to properties inherent in matter, the origin of everything, by a process of self-transformation. Whether God exists, that is simply immaterial, and I want to make it very clear. Not all evolutionists are atheists. As a matter of fact, most are not. But the theory itself is a non-theistic theory. God is not involved. God, by the very definition you see, is excluded from this process. It's a process of self-transformation, and it's directional. It goes to higher and higher levels of organization in its products. We go from disorder to order. We go from simple to complex. And it includes everything. The stars, the galaxies, our solar system, life on this planet, and all living things, including man, with our 30 trillion cells of over 200 varieties, with our consciousness, our ability to remember the past, to deal with the present, and to plan for the future. Even our very faith in God is a result of this evolutionary process according to this definition. Now we contrast that non-theistic, mechanistic, naturalistic explanation to the theistic, supernatural, creationist position. The creationist says, no, this is not possible. As I mentioned, the universe could not have created itself. Life could not have arisen spontaneously and naturally. Therefore, they had to be created supernaturally. And so we have the stark contrast between these two basic explanations of creation and evolution. Now, how can we know which is right? I wasn't there. Dr. Emsley wasn't there. None of you were there. None of us saw the origin of the universe or the origin of life or the origin of a single living thing. Neither creation nor evolution, properly defined, is a scientific theory. Creation and evolution are inferences based upon circumstantial evidence. We are trying to infer what happened in the past when there were no witnesses. And obviously no one has ever seen anything created, nor can anyone test the theory, say, on how a fish may have evolved into an amphibian or an ape into man. But, as Dr. Emsley has mentioned, there is evidence available. And of course, if evolution is true, there must be no contradiction between the facts of science, natural processes, natural laws, and the theory of evolution. There must be no contradictions whatsoever. Well, let's take a look at the evidence. Let's go out there in the real world and take a look and see what's going on. Now, if evolution is true, if we start with a Big Bang billions of years ago, and this Big Bang generated hydrogen gas, and by the way, that's all there was at that time, billions of years ago, just hydrogen gas, a minor amount of helium. And this hydrogen gas expanded out in the vast stretches of the universe. Now, that's all there was, just hydrogen gas. That was the universe. And then from this, stars created themselves and galaxies created themselves. Our solar system created itself. Life evolved on this planet, and finally man evolved. So we've gone from hydrogen gas to people. Someone said if that's true, then we can say that hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given sufficient time, becomes people. And of course, that is precisely what evolutionists believe. They've got to believe that. Of course, there was nothing but hydrogen gas then, and now there's people. So you see, that must be true. As a scientist, I find that notion clearly incredible. But this is what they suggest. Now, if that's true, then matter must have this inherent ability to transform itself from chaos and disorder to the cosmos. It must have this ability to transform itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. That must be true if evolution is true. And scientists should have been able to discover this inherent tendency and would have formalized it into a natural law today. On the other hand, if creation is true, we would not expect that matter would have any inherent tendency to promote itself to higher and higher levels of organization. But if anything has happened since creation to change that initial created state, therefore, that tendency could only be downward. There might be an inherent tendency of matter to go from order to disorder, from complex to simple, if creation is true. Now we have two diametrically opposed theories here. All right, let's go out there and see what's going on. First of all, may I point out, ladies and gentlemen, no one has ever discovered any inherent tendency of matter to promote itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. Matter tendency of all systems to go from order to disorder, from complex to simple. It is so all-pervasive, so all-unfailing, that it has been formalized into a natural law, the second law of thermodynamics. Let us see what Isaac Asimov has to say about this second law of thermodynamics. He is an evolutionist, very strong anti-creationist. The article was published in the Smithsonian Institute Journal, June of 1970. And this is what Isaac Asimov, this evolutionist, has to say about the second law of thermodynamics. He says, and I quote, "Another way of stating the second law then is, the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. Viewed that way, we can see the second law all about us. We have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself it becomes a mess again, very quickly and very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery and our own bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is nothing. And everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out, all by itself. And that is what the second law is all about." End of quote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if that's what the second law of thermodynamics is all about, it seems to me, indeed, evolution is in trouble. You see, if evolution is true, there must be this intrinsic tendency or ability to go in the opposite direction that we find in the real universe. Everything in the real universe goes downward, always this inherent tendency. There's always the tendency for complex systems to become randomized and simplified, to go from order to disorder, no matter whether we're talking about stars or galaxies or human bodies or what. As a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, every star in this universe is going to shrink here. All right, let's go out there and see what's going on. First of all, may I point out, ladies and gentlemen, no one has ever discovered any inherent tendency of matter to promote itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. Matter does not have that natural tendency. There is no natural law which describes such an inherent tendency of matter. However, we have discovered precisely the opposite. There is a natural law called the second law of thermodynamics, which describes the inherent tendency of all systems to go from order to disorder, from complex to simple. It is so all-pervasive, so all unfailing, that it has been formalized into a natural law, the second law of thermodynamics. Let us see what Isaac Asimov has to say about this second law of thermodynamics. He is an evolutionist, very strong anti-creationist. This article was published in the Smithsonian Institute Journal, June of 1970. And this is what Isaac Asimov, this evolutionist, has to say about the second law of thermodynamics. He says, and I quote, "Another way of stating the second law then is, the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. Viewed that way, we can see the second law all about us. We have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself it becomes a mess again, very quickly and very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery and our own bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is nothing. And everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out, all by itself. And that is what the second law is all about." End of quote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if that's what the second law of thermodynamics is all about, it seems to me, indeed, evolution is in trouble. You see, if evolution is true, there must be this intrinsic tendency or ability to go in the opposite direction that we find in the real universe. Everything in the real universe goes downward, always this inherent tendency. There's always the tendency for complex systems to become randomized and simplified, to go from order to disorder, no matter whether we're talking about stars or galaxies or human bodies or what. As a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, every star in this universe is going to someday reach that point when they will have all exhausted their fuel, and they'll all be cold and dark, and the universe will be dead. That is, if there is no God, or if God would not choose to intervene, this universe has one certain destiny: it is going to die. Now, my question is this: if the natural laws and natural processes now governing the universe are leading inexorably to its death and destruction, And if, as evolutionists believe, these natural laws and natural processes are all there is and all there ever has been, how then could those very same natural laws and processes create the universe in the first place? Is it possible that the very same natural laws and processes that are destroying the universe could have been responsible for its origin? What sort of tortured logic would one have to use to reach such an impossible conclusion? Now, the second law says one thing if it says anything. If you have an isolated system, that's a system on which no one is doing any work. It's a system on which nothing is being brought in from the outside. It's an isolated system, a closed system, a system in which everything taking place is a process of self-transformation. Those systems will inevitably, without exception, always deteriorate and decay with time. They will never, absolutely never become more complex, more highly structured. Never. And yet evolutionists believe the universe is an isolated or closed system which started in this primordial state of disorder, and it transformed itself from that state of disorder and simplicity to the very highly complex universe that we have today. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a physical impossibility. It could not have taken place, and the universe simply could not have created itself. Now let's leave that for a moment, the problem of the origin of life. Now here we see an enzyme. This is ribonuclease, has 124 amino acids in it. All enzymes are proteins. The average size of proteins is 400 amino acids, so this is a rather small protein. There are 20 different kinds of amino acids, as Dr. Emsley has pointed out. Furthermore, as he has pointed out very well, all amino acids that occur in protein today, without exception, are left-handed amino acids. And chemically, if everything was produced chemically, as evolution would demand, you have 50% of the left-handed and 50% of the right-handed. None is preferred over the other. Furthermore, when they combine chemically, one combines just as readily as the other. And if proteins arose by chemical evolution, you would have 50% left-handed and 50% right-handed. There is absolutely no way to select one over the other. And if the first one happened to be the left-handed, the next one might be right-handed, it might be left-handed, the third one might be left-handed or right-handed, and so forth and so on. There is absolutely no way that you can account for the fact that these amino acids are all left-handed today except by deliberate, intelligent choice. Chemistry could never have done that. Let's set aside that problem. We have another very, very important problem. You see, in order to have ribonuclease, you have to have these amino acids arranged in precise order. Lysine, glutamic acid, threonine, alanine, lysine, phenylalanine, glutamic acid, arginine, glutamine, histamine, so forth and so on. 124 amino acids arranged in precise order. Hemoglobin has 287 amino acids in the alpha and beta chain, arranged in precise order. Not an enzyme, but it binds oxygen. Human growth hormone has 188 amino acids arranged in precise order. Not an enzyme, doesn't bind oxygen, but it's a hormone. Why do these proteins perform that biological function so beautifully, so precisely, so specifically? Because of the highly precise arrangement of those amino acids. Now you can make some changes, but not much. Now, calculate the probability of getting all of these in just that order. You see, the evolutionist has no biochemist, he has no creator, has no intelligence, no purpose, no design, no plan. Things just happen. Well, calculate the probability that things would just happen to get arranged in that way, whether it happened instantaneously or whether it happened one at a time with a billion years in between. The probability remains the same. 20 different kinds of amino acids, 1 chance out of 20 for lysine. 1 over 20 times 1 over 20 that you'll have lysine number 1, glutamic acid number 3. 1 over 20 times itself 3 times to get 3, times itself 4 times to get 4, and times itself 124 times to get those 124 amino acids. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that would never happen on this earth. If you could make 1 trillion times a second for the 10 to 18 seconds that we have in 5 billion years, you wouldn't have a ghost of a chance of getting that particular arrangement. Because the number of different ways you can arrange those amino acids is so astronomical. No, astronomical is not the right word. vastly in excess of any astronomical number. The probability is so vastly low it would never happen. And if it did happen, you would have one single molecule of one single protein. But ladies and gentlemen, you've got to have billions of tons each of hundreds of different kinds of proteins and billions of tons each of DNA and RNA molecules, vastly more complex than a protein molecule. They isolated recently the gene that codes for blood clotting factor 8. It has 186,000 nucleotides, 186,000 units arranged in precise order. No way would you ever get something like that by any combination of chance processes. Now, of course, you've got to have much more than the molecules. You've got to have the cell with its membranes and energy factories and protein factories and genetic material. And all that has to be arranged in very complex ways. The human brain has 12 billion brain cells, more than 100 trillion connections, and more than 100 neurotransmitters. The most complex arrangement of matter in the universe, and nothing but the product of hydrogen gas, according to evolution. Now, some people refuse to believe that. Here's an article appeared in the Daily Express in London, August 14th, 1981. Two skeptical scientists put their heads together and reached an amazing conclusion. There must be a God. One of these scientists was Sir Fred Hoyle, the famous British astronomer, and I would say if he's not the most famous astronomer in the world, he's certainly one of the most famous astronomers in the world, and his friend and colleague, Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, professor and chairman of Applied Mathematics and Astronomy, University College, Cardiff, Wales. Now, when these two scientists began their study, they were both atheists, and so they had no prejudice, no preconceived ideas towards the creationist point of view. But they made certain assumptions about the minimum requirement to get life started. Then they calculated the probability of life evolving on this planet in 5 billion years. The probability turned out to be one chance out of the number 1 followed by 40,000 zeros. Well, that's just flatly zero. But they said there's 100 billion galaxies. Each galaxy contains 100 billion stars. Let us assume that every star in the universe has a planet like the Earth. Let us assume that the universe is 20 billion years old. Now, let us calculate the probability that life has evolved somewhere in the universe in that 20 billion years. The answer came back, forget about it. The probability was so low it was essentially nil. Sir Fred Hoyle said the probability of evolution is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. I tell people, if you want to believe that, that's okay, but just don't call it science. Well, they concluded, therefore, that life could not have evolved naturally anywhere in the universe. Therefore, it had to be created. Therefore, there must be a God. They don't believe in the Bible. They don't believe in the book of Genesis. But they are creationists. They're saying that wherever life exists in the universe, it had to be created. And I certainly totally disagree with these conclusions. The idea that life has evolved on this planet is nothing more than 20th century mythology without any basis in fact. In fact, as a matter of fact, based upon what we do know about science, we can say it's absolutely impossible. Now let's leave this matter and go to the fossil record itself. We have 250,000 different fossil species in our museums today. Certainly an immeasurably rich fossil record. These are represented by tens of millions of fossils. And if life began billions of years ago, a little microscopic single-cell organism, which then multiplied and diversified into all the millions of species that now live and have lived in the past, during that hundreds of millions of years of time, then our museum should be overflowing with intermediate forms, fossils of intermediate. There should be absolutely no doubt about the fact of evolution. There'd be no question, no debate. I would not be here today. There'd be no debate. Absolutely no doubt about it. You go right down to the Smithsonian Institute and you see those intermediate forms just lying all over the place. Undoubted, unquestionable intermediate forms. On the other hand, if creation is true, we'd expect each one of the basic types, plants and animals, which you might call the created kinds, or the basic morphological design, to appear fully formed right at the start without any intermediate, without any indication that they had arisen from a common ancestor. Now let's look at the actual fossil record and see what we do find. As a matter of fact, there's just really no contest. Creation wins hands down, when we look at that evidence. Now, Darwin knew that the fossil record was an embarrassment to his theory, and he said so. But he felt that the future would take care of the problem. The missing links would be found. Well, the missing links are still missing. And what we have is each one of the basic types, the phyla, classes, orders, and down to and including almost every family, have appeared fully formed right at the start. Here, for example, we have the reconstructions of animals whose fossils are found in Cambrian rocks. Evolutionists believe the Cambrian began to form 600 million years ago and took about 80 to 100 million years to form. Now, in these Cambrian rocks, we have a tremendous variety of very complex creatures. We have sea urchins, trilobites, the sponges, jellyfish, the swimming crustacean Sydnea, sea lilies, snails, clams, brachiopods, worms, and a great variety of very highly complex forms. Now, by the way, every one of these creatures are still living today. Not that in these individual species, but certainly we have jellyfish and sponges and sea urchins and every one of these except the trilobite still living today. Now, supposedly these things evolved from little microscopic single-cell organisms. Well, in the Precambrian rocks, which generally underlie the Cambrian, rocks which evolutionists believe were laid down in the hundreds of millions of years before the Cambrian, many of which are undisturbed, perfectly suitable for the preservation of fossils. In those rocks, now, there are many reports of discovery of fossil bacteria and algae. Now, these are little microscopic, single-celled, soft-bodied organisms. Now, if those creatures evolved into these creatures, then the rocks must contain an enormous number of the intermediates. We have billions times billions of these creatures, probably times billions again. And if we can find fossils of little microscopic soft-bodied organisms, we certainly could find fossils of everything intermediate. Ladies and gentlemen, we have never found one single fossil intermediate leading up to these creatures. Not one, nowhere on the face of this earth. Every one of these creatures, whether it's a sea urchin or the jellyfish or sponges or sea lilies or whatever, they appear fully formed right at the start. We see that illustrated here in this slide. Now, you wouldn't see that. Don't pretend you're seeing anything there because it's microscopic, so you couldn't see it. But over here you have all these complex invertebrates in between. Well, it says 1.5 billion years. Evolution has stretched that out now to 3 billion years. You have 3 billion years and nothing to document any evolutionary change. There are no intermediates that have ever been discovered for these Cambrian animals. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the debate is over with. There's absolutely no question. Evolution has not taken place. If we're going to go on the basis of the hard physical evidence, the scientific evidence, there's no doubt evolution has not occurred. Those creatures, all different from one another, very complex, just pop into the fossil record fully formed. An explosive appearance of very complex creatures. Powerful, positive evidence for creation. Now, it is supposed that one of these invertebrates evolved into a fish. Evolutionists believe it took 100 million years. Some little soft-bodied creature like a jellyfish or a worm, or a creature with a shell, soft inner part, evolved into a vertebrate with soft outer part and hard inner part or skeleton. Why, if that's true, billions times billions of those things would have lived and died during that 100 million years, and our museum should have hundreds of thousands of those intermediates. Ladies and gentlemen, they don't have one. Go over to the Smithsonian Institute. See if you can find a fossil intermediate between an invertebrate and a fish. Every major kind of fish that we know anything about has its origins firmly based in nothing. They just pop into the fossil record fully formed. Ladies and gentlemen, why should we quarrel or talk about whether Archaeopteryx is a transitional form or the Australopithecines or horses or anything else? Ladies and gentlemen, vertebrates have not evolved. So obviously nothing within the vertebrates have evolved. These gaps are so immense and so indisputable that this simply settles the case. There is no evidence that these creatures have evolved, and if that's true, then evolution simply has not taken place. You see that here, the fish and the invertebrates with nothing in between. Now, very briefly, I will discuss fossil evidence related to man very briefly. Supposedly we have a series like that going from some ape-like creature to man, and evolutionists believe there must have been thousands of these intermediate stages actually during the millions of years it took some ape-like creature to evolve into man. And they've been looking for fossils of these creatures, and they have made some claims. One of the more prominent claims has to do with the Australopithecines. Australopithecus was first discovered in South Africa by Dr. Raymond Dart in 1924. It was very ape-like, as was this skull discovered by Dr. Louis Leakey and his wife Mary in East Africa in 1959. We see the sagittal crest, typical of ape, no forehead, very flat head, massive eyebrow ridges, massive jaws and teeth, but they claimed the teeth were somewhat man-like, and claimed that they walked upright. And later on, Dr. Donald Johanson discovered a series of creatures in Ethiopia to which he gave the name Australopithecus afarensis. One of these was of a female about 40% complete. He gave it the name Lucy. He proclaimed that although Lucy was ape from the neck up, she had the jaws, teeth, face, and brain of an ape, nevertheless she walked upright in the human manner. Sensational, and it captured the imagination of everyone. Dr. Johanson became world famous, and the consensus in evolutionary circles today that indeed these creatures, although they were grossly ape-like, did walk erect in the human manner, so constituted some sort of a transitional form. However, there are significant numbers of scientists who do not believe that, scientists who are not creationists, have no bias towards our point of view. One of these scientists is Lord Zuckerman. Dr. Solly Zuckerman, for many years the head of the Department of Anatomy, University of Birmingham in England. He had a scientific team that studied these fossils for over 15 years. Not a creationist, has no bias towards our point of view. Dr. Zuckerman was first knighted and then raised to the peerage. Lord Zuckerman studied, as I said, these creatures using the most sophisticated methods of analysis available, and he concluded after all this research, these creatures did not walk upright. They are not intermediate from ape and man, and they certainly were not ancestral to man. That also was the conclusion of Dr. Charles Oxnard, one of Zuckerman's former students, who is now professor of anatomy at the University of Southern California Medical School. Dr. Oxnard has studied principally the postcranial skeleton of these creatures, the foot bones, the leg bones, the knee joints, and the pelvis and so forth, and he has concluded from that research, again, that these creatures are not intermediate from ape and man, and they are certainly not ancestral to man. Now, I believe they have done the best research on these creatures available, and if you remove these creatures from the family tree of man, believe me, there is just not much left. And just look at the sorry track record of evolutionists in this area. Here's the Piltdown man, stood for nearly 50 years as our ancestor, turned out to be a hoax, a fraud. Some doctored up ape jaw and human skull planted in a gravel pit near Piltdown, England, and fooled the world's greatest experts for nearly 50 years. And then we have the famous Nebraska man, reconstructed from a single tooth found in western Nebraska in 1922. And here we see the man and his wife and the tools they were using, all based upon that single tooth. But scientists were very excited by the discovery of this tooth because they thought it had some characteristics intermediate between ape and man. Well, finally, some additional remains were discovered. He turned out to be neither a man-like ape nor an ape-like man. He turned out to be a pig. It was nothing more than a pig's tooth. But this is the picture that appeared in the Illustrated London News in 1922, based upon the descriptions of the scientists. Then we have the Neanderthal man. Here's the picture of Neanderthal man that stood for many years as this long-armed, knuckle-dragging, beetle-browed, stoop-shouldered, bow-legged subhuman. Well, it turned out that all of these primitive features were due to pathological conditions, due to rickets or a vitamin D deficiency, which causes bone to become soft and deformed, and arthritis, which caused them to walk in a sort of a hunched-over way, like as if they weren't completely erect. They were just simply due to these pathological conditions. About 25 or 30 years ago, a couple of scientists published an article about the Neanderthal people, and they said, now really, if you take Neanderthal man, give him a shave and a haircut, give him a bath, put him in a business suit, and place him on a New York subway, no one would take a second look. Well, of course, today you wouldn't have to give him a shave or a haircut. some circles in San Diego, you wouldn't even have to give him a bath. But he has been upgraded. He has been upgraded to Homo sapiens, and here we have the modern picture of Neanderthal man. He is now judged to be Homo sapiens like you and I. So you see, he was not our ancestor, he was man. Nebraska man was not our ancestor, it was the pigs too. The Piltdown man was not our ancestor, it was a combination of an ape's jaw and a human skull. Ramapithecus, which had been long believed to be the common ancestor of ape and man, turned out to be an orangutan. And I believe that with the passage of time, we'll find that the Australopithecines and others are going to be kicked out of the family tree of man as well. Here's the final conclusion of Lord Zuckerman after his many years of research, searching for man's fossil ancestry. Published in his book, Beyond the Ivory Tower, in 1970. On page 64, Lord Zuckerman makes the following statement. He says, "No scientist could logically dispute the proposition that man, without having been involved in any act of divine creation, evolved from some ape-like creature in a very short space of time, speaking in geological terms, without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of the transformation." End of quote. You see what Lord Zuckerman is saying? If we exclude the possibility of creation, then obviously man must have evolved from an ape-like creature. But if he did, there's absolutely no evidence for it in the fossil record. That is not what you get in your textbook. It's not what you read in National Geographic or Time Life or see on TV and read in your newspapers. But that's a considered judgment of this outstanding scientist after many years of research on the subject, and I certainly agree with him. Now, Charles Darwin said, if there was any organ or structure that we could not explain as a result of gradual changes through natural selection, then his theory would be disproved. Let me describe one. And it is an example of a general process called metamorphosis. Here we see a monarch butterfly, a beautiful creature, with a proboscis for sucking nectar out of flowers and so forth, so on. A beautiful flying creature. Well, he starts out as an egg. This is the new egg, and this is the maturing egg. And then the egg hatches into the caterpillar. And here's a relatively new caterpillar. They go through a number of molts. See here, he's chewed a big hole in a leaf. He has mouth parts for chewing up leaves. Of course, he has legs by which he crawls. Here we have one of the final stages of the caterpillar with 3 legs and a number of prolegs. And there he is, a crawling creature with the ability to chew up leaves. But he decides that's a very humdrum way to live. And he sees all these creatures flying around and it looks so beautiful and so much fun, he decided he'd like to be a butterfly. Now he realizes, however, he has nothing to recommend him to be a butterfly. He's just a slow, crawling creature with legs and those mouth parts for chewing up leaves. How is he going to pull the trick? He has to go back to ground zero. And so he devises a very clever trick. Here's the J form. He hooks his last pro leg to a leaf and he curls around. And then I'll just give you a few stages. Here he is in a stage of shedding the last molt and forming the chrysalis or pupa. Here is the final stage. Here is the chrysalis or pupa. Now he's just a mass of jelly. So he's gone back to ground zero. He's reduced himself to a mass of jelly, and now all he has to do is do one little simple trick. He has to program a mass of jelly to become a butterfly. No big deal for a caterpillar, apparently, because sure enough, the butterfly begins to develop, goes through a number of stages. He kicks out of the pupa. Here he is inflating his wings, some fluid in his tummy, and finally he ends up as the adult butterfly. And the creature develops according to this preconceived plan and has nothing to do with evolution. The legs do not evolve into wings. None of these things evolve into anything else. They are resorbed and completely new structures are produced according to the plan in that fertilized egg. How could anyone even attempt to explain that on an evolutionary basis? Slow, gradual, step by step, genetic mistake by genetic mistake, by natural selection, whereby the worm changes into a butterfly. No, there is no way, there is no explanation. The only explanation is, therefore, that it was designed to do so. You know, it took thousands and thousands of engineers and material scientists and mathematicians and others to design the spacecraft that landed on Mars. Why did we get there? Because absolutely nothing was left to chance. That spacecraft did not evolve, ladies and gentlemen, from an automobile or an airplane or from a buggy. It was produced by the intelligent activity of a human being, or thousands and thousands of human beings, and still it wasn't perfect. We saw what happened a year ago last January in that tragic accident. And yet no one would deny that those craft were designed by an intelligent human being, by the deliberate, creative acts of an intelligent creator. Now, let us go to this matter of molecular homology. And can we have just a minute or so to get these things ready? I don't want to lose time doing that. I understand there's somebody that's going to show my transparencies for me. I have just a few I'd like to show. Is there somebody here to do that? All right, I'd like to put the one on top first, and then I'll call for the other. All right, so just give me an extra minute for this. Now, we'll get that first transparency, and we want to turn the projector off. All right. Now here's the evolutionary interpretation that Dr. Emsley gave us in the standard evolutionary interpretation of the differences you see between man and chimpanzee, only 1.6% in the DNA, and 1.4 more between the man and gorilla, and the greater distance between the orangutan, and so forth and so on. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to point out, first of all, the data we have are only from those living organisms. We do not have any fossil molecule. All of these numbers are simply supplied according to the preconceived notion of evolutionists. A reasonable interpretation of evolution is true, but simply an interpretation. Those figures do not exist. The only thing that exists is the difference between man and chimpanzee and a gorilla, and so forth. And evolutionists point out, look, man is only 1.6% different from a chimpanzee. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit there's a greater difference than that, but let us assume that that's true. A chimpanzee then missed being a man by only 1.6%, we are told. Well, a cloud is 100% water. A watermelon is 97% water. So a cloud missed being a watermelon by only 3%, according to this interpretation. Well, I submit that 3% is extremely important. And whatever difference exists between man and chimpanzee is extremely important, and as a result of the deliberate creative acts of a creator. Now, I've had evolution tell me that is the only interpretation you can give of that data. Let me give you an interpretation by another evolutionist. Next slide, please. Gregory Warr and Christian Schwab, his name is spelled S-C-H-W-A-B-E, but it's Schwab or Schwab or Schwabi, I don't know. They published an article, now I'll get that reference for you. They published an article in Perspectives in Biology and Medicine, volume 27, number 3, spring of 1984, which they pointed out there is a very different interpretation. This is the usual interpretation, the evolutionary tree. They said, now look, that's the only data you have. You don't have that data down there. Again, this is the only data you have. Now look, they said, actually, you could have started out with entirely different, each gene being the start right out from the very beginning. Those genes could have been there right from the beginning and have gone through time to produce exactly the same thing you have here without any evolutionary tree at all. Next slide, please, or transparency. And they say, now here you see, you can interpret as a tree in this manner, but you can also interpret in that manner as having separate beginnings. And of course, that is precisely the interpretation of the creation. Those genes were right there from the beginning. And they point out there's many contradictions in this evolutionary data when you try to get a tree. They point out that if you take relaxins, which are a hormone, take those amino acid sequence, you don't get an evolutionary tree that agree with this at all. You have the pig, rat, and shark, very different from one another. The insulins, pig, carp, and shark, are very different from one another. And the lysozymes and so forth. And they point out the many contradictions, and let me just give you their final conclusion from these two evolutionists about this idea of molecular homology. This is what they say. The major conclusion to which we wish to draw attention is that these findings strongly suggest that many of the genes purportedly produced by gene duplication have been present very early in the development of life. In fact, we can ask if they were not present so early that we must question whether any gene has come about by duplication or whether all have been there from the beginning as the potential for species development. End of quote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these are not creationists. Those are evolutionists saying precisely what we creationists are saying. You see, the genes were there from the very beginning. Now, they believe, of course, that in each case they evolved. We believe that they were created, but their interpretation is totally different from the standard evolutionary interpretation. Well, we've run out of time, ladies and gentlemen. We'll discuss this a little bit more later, but let me just say this. When we look at all of the scientific evidence, the evidence from the fossils, the evidence from thermodynamics, evidence from probability, evidence from molecular biology and all these fields, I believe the best statement we can make about our origins is still, in the beginning, God created. Thank you very much.
So, without any further ado, we will now turn to Dr. Emsley for his first 10-minute rebuttal period.
Thank you very much, Mr. Farris.
Yeah, time.
You know, I've heard Dr. Gish quite a number of times on tapes and videos, and I'm really surprised he's still beating this dead old warhorse about entropy. You only have to walk outside tomorrow morning and find that the sun is shining to understand where the energy comes from to build complex molecules on Earth. The growth of a person from a child to an adult is an increase in complexity. It's perfectly similar to the increase in complexity from a single cell 4 billion years ago to man today. Entropy is absolutely not an issue in this debate. And anticipating what might happen, some of you saw me shaking up some oil and water on the stage here just before Dr. Gish began to talk. Now, this jar, which normally contains milk for my wife's lunch, is a closed system. When I set it down on the podium there, it was an intimate mixture of oil and water. High degree of randomness, high degree of entropy. Now you see it. It's sorted itself out. The level of entropy has declined. And yet, it's been standing on this podium ever since I mixed it. Entropy is not an issue in evolution and should never really have been brought up. Dr. Gish mentioned the origin of life. He mentioned the origin of the universe. Many of you may know Dr. Gish's book, Evolution. The fossils say no. On page 42, and I just typed it out so that I wouldn't have to hold the book up, Dr. Gish says the following: "We do not know how God created, what processes he used, for God used processes which are not now operating anywhere in the natural universe. This is why we refer to divine creation as special creation. We cannot discover by scientific investigations anything about the creative process used by God." And I'm in the same situation. I have no way of knowing how the universe was created. For all I know, our universe may be part of a huge system like our solar system is part of a galaxy. We have no way of knowing. And so that's an aspect of this that we really can't debate. We may have our own private speculation, but that's the best it can be. Dr. Gish also referred to the gaps in the fossil record. And indeed, as I mentioned, there are some. Let me quote Dr. Gish. Evolution, fossils say no, page 51. "It is true," he says, "that only a tiny fraction of all plants and animals that have ever existed would have been preserved as fossils. It is also true that we have as yet uncovered only a small fraction of the fossils that are entombed in the rocks. I have to agree. If his number is correct, and I can only accept it at face value, he said we have 250,000 fossils. Over the age of the Earth, that is one for every 2,500 years. Should we be surprised that we don't have a more complete record than we do? When you think of the chance of an organism dying in such a situation that it gets fossilized, and if it's an old organism, it's got to become fossilized, and then that rock has not got to undergo change. It mustn't be heated and compressed and distorted, and then it's got to be in a situation where an archaeologist or an anthropologist or a paleontologist can find it. The chance of all those happening is so small, I think it's astonishing that the record is as good as it is. He also mentioned the fact that these Cambrian fossils of soft-bodied organisms, and then we have these organisms with hard shells. Now, where have they come from? Well, I haven't got a better answer than he has, really, except that we find substantial phosphate deposits being laid down in the earth at about the same time we find shelled organisms. And so it is speculative, but it may well be that organisms couldn't make shells until they had the raw material. They had to have calcium phosphate to make it. And so once you get an environment in which shells and hard skeletons can be made, then we have a much more substantial record. Prior to that, only fossils, only soft-bodied organisms. We don't have time to discuss the individual merits of these gaps. And what I would just like to point out is that much of the so-called scientific investigations which support, shall we say, the age of the Earth, really should not be taken at their face value. Dr. Morris, some time ago, took the human population between the years 1650 and 1800, and he extrapolated that population growth curve backwards in time and demonstrated that 6,300 years ago there were just 2 people on Earth. That was very consistent with what he would like to show. But now common sense tells you that that cannot be true. 4,500 years ago, the pyramids were built. If Egypt is 1% of the Earth's surface, and you look along Dr. Morris's curve to 4,500 years ago, you find there were 600 people on Earth. If they're evenly distributed, there are only 6 in Egypt. One was a pharaoh, one was his wife, and 4 laborers. It just won't work. The Earth has to be very old. Just to close this particular episode, I'd like to tell you a little story. It won't take very long. That a famous creationist, who I believe his name was Dr. Wish, was going to his luncheon date one day, and he passed by a front yard in which there was a small boy playing with some newborn puppies. And being a very genial gentleman, he went over and said, "Oh, that's very nice to see a young man playing so kindly with these newborn animals." And the little boy looked up and said, "Dr. Wish, I know who you are. You'll be pleased to hear that these puppies are creationists." Oh, he glowed. About a week later, he had had a visit from an evolutionist called Dr. Pagan. And he invited Dr. Pagan to come out to lunch with him, and he took a route past this front yard. The boy was still there. He said, "Come on, I want you to meet this young man." So he took him over, and he said, "Young man, tell my colleague here about the attitude and the conviction of your puppies? And the boy looked up and said, "Oh, yes, they're evolutionists." "What? You told me they were creationists." "Ah," said the boy, "but they've got their eyes open now."
Dr. Gish will now begin his 10-minute rebuttal period.
Well, I must say I'm very surprised that Dr. Emsley would mention this attempt to get around the laws of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, through the example of the egg and his example there. Now, his example there just points out the fact that something that's lighter than water floats. That's all that demonstrates. Now, the fact that an egg can produce adults, no problem. I agree with that. No contradiction, second law of thermodynamics. Really, ladies and gentlemen, I have no problem accounting for babies as long as you start with parents. But you see, the evolutionist, he's got to account for babies with no parents. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? If you start with the egg, no problem getting a chicken. Or if you have a chicken, no problem getting the egg. But the problem is when you have neither the egg nor the chicken of producing either. You see, that's the problem. And that's the problem he has not even addressed, let alone answer. The problem is, how do you get complicated, very complex systems such as photosynthesis, which utilizes the energy from the sun when you did not have photosynthesis, when you had no machinery whatsoever? You see, when the universal natural tendencies to go downward, to decay, to deteriorate, how do these complicated, indescribably complex systems produce themselves? Against that, you see, that's the impossibility. Now, he quoted from my book concerning the rarity of fossilization. Of course, I agree. I wrote that. But what he did not quote was this. If we could find only a tiny fraction of all fossils, and if they represented only a very tiny fraction of animals that ever lived, we would still have a tremendously rich fossil record. As I mentioned, we have 250,000 different fossil species. If evolution was true, tens of thousands of those things would be undoubted transitional form. What does the Harris poll do? The Gallup poll. They talk to 2,000 people out of 200 million people and tell you how you're going to vote. Now, that's considered an adequate sampling, and I submit that 250,000 species, fossil species, is more than an adequate sampling of the fossil record. Ladies and gentlemen, the fact those transitional forms are not there, that's a fact, and they agree perfectly with creation. Now, the idea that phosphates appeared in the ocean about the time that those hard shells, ladies and gentlemen, a hard shell creature could not evolve directly from a soft-bodied creature. Their soft anatomy is totally different, totally integrated with those hard parts. And they must have evolved from animals with other hard parts. And furthermore, you can't have any phosphates, phosphoric acid, floating around the water anyhow, because phosphoric acid reacts with calcium to produce insoluble calcium phosphate and be on the bottom of the ocean. The phosphate must be present in the living organism. Now, about the matter of homology. Well, of course, the evolutionists looked at the evidence and said, well, that looks reasonable. If we have forelimbs similar to forelimbs of horses or bats or something like that, we must have those forelimbs because we inherited them from a common ancestor. Isn't that reasonable? Well, of course it is. But it's totally wrong. It's totally false. I have a book here published by Sir Gavin de Beer, the British biologist and evolutionist. This was his little Oxford biology reader published in 1971 entitled Homology, an Unsolved Problem. The actual scientific evidence is so contrary to this notion that similar structures in different animals have been inherited from a common ancestor that Sir Gavin had to admit it just simply was false. The evidence didn't fit that notion at all. And the crowning blow was the genetic evidence. Here's what Gavin de Beer says on page 16 of this little booklet. He says, it is now clear that the pride with which it was assumed that the inheritance of a homologous structure from a common ancestor explained homology was misplaced, for such inheritance cannot be ascribed to identity of gene. The attempt to find homologous genes except in closely related species has been given up as hopeless. End of quote. Now let me explain, ladies and gentlemen. We have the vertebrate eye. All vertebrates have similar eyes. Our eyes are very similar to the eyes of fishes. Why? Well, the evolution says all vertebrates have inherited the genes that determine the eyes from a common ancestor. Therefore, these genes would be very similar. They would be homologous. However, when you look at those genes, they are totally different. There's no homology at all. Furthermore, as Sir Gavin looked at all of this other evidence, it was contradictory to what the evolutionists would expect. So he had to title his little book, Homology, an Unsolved Problem. Of course, if the data fit evolution, if it confirmed evolution, he would write Homology, a solved problem. But the evidence is totally contradictory. The other interpretation, of course, is these similar structures were created by the master engineer to solve similar problems. An engineer designs and builds bridges. They're very similar. Not exactly the same, but he uses good sound engineering principles in his design and building these bridges, and so they are similar. But they're not identical. Well, of course, that doesn't prove that all bridges evolved from a common ancestor either, you see, the result of an intelligent creator. Now, furthermore, the idea of embryological recapitulation, known to be a false notion. Not only do creatures, as the embryo develop, not only does it not resemble its adult ancestors, neither do the embryos recapitulate. I have an article here, a quote from a man, got it here somewhere. Yes, here it is, from a book by E. Bluckschmidt, The Beginnings of Life, published in 1977. On page 32, now this embryological recapitulation idea is also called the law of biogenesis. And he says this: the so-called basic law of biogenetics is wrong. No buts or ifs can mitigate this fact. It is not even a tiny bit correct, or correct in a different form. It is totally wrong. And others have said the same thing, ladies and gentlemen. Embryos don't recapitulate any evolutionary history. They just do what they must do to develop from a single cell into an adult creature. And as far as the kidneys are concerned, well, this is what Alfred Romer had to say about this. This is taken from The Vertebrate Body, 1965, page 283. Dr. Romer says, we see in this story of development in the embryo of three successive kidney structures: pronephros, mesonephros, metanephros. It is often stated or implied, as Dr. Emsley did, standard evolutionary interpretation, it is often stated or implied that these three are distinct kidneys and which have succeeded one another phylogenetically as they do embryologically. Upon consideration, however, it will be seen that there is no strong reason to believe this. The differences are readily explainable on functional grounds. End of quote. End of quote. So out goes that evidence, you see. Now, furthermore, take the development of the embryo. Take the newt, which is an amphibian. The forelimbs develop from trunk segments 2 to 5. In the embryo of the lizard, a reptile, the forelimbs develop from trunk segments 6 to 9. And in man, the forelimbs develop from trunk segments 13 to 18. Obviously, embryos are not recapitulating embryo development of their so-called ancestor. It is just totally wrong. The evidence then supports the creationist interpretation and certainly not the evolutionist interpretation. As far as molecular homology, let me just go back to that a moment. We are supposed to be more similar to the chimpanzee based upon molecular homology, based upon the molecules. Jeffrey Schwartz, University of Pittsburgh, who is an evolutionist, says based upon morphology, that is gross structure, man is much more similar to the orangutan than he is the chimpanzee. Now the molecular homologist, the one who uses molecules to relate things, says that we are most closely related to the chimpanzee, much more closely related to the chimp than we are to the orangutan. Jeffrey Schwartz says, just looking at our morphological structure, we are much more similar to the orangutan than we are to the chimpanzee. And so we get totally different answers, you see, based upon this sort of evidence. Now, well, I did state that the creationists cannot absolutely know how God created. If I know how God created, it wouldn't be creation. And if God came down and told me how he created, I still wouldn't understand what in the world he was talking about. It's impossible to understand that. But the evolutionist, he is supposed to understand this. He's not supposed to appeal to some unknown process. He is supposed to be able to explain the origin of the universe and the origin of everything based upon the same natural laws and processes which are existing today. The creationist says God created those natural processes. And the universe then did not come into being by those natural processes, but by the same creative processes of God that created the natural processes. Well, we're out of time. We'll be back. Thank you.
Dr. Emsley now has 5 minutes for his final rebuttal.
When I left the office at lunchtime, the secretary said, "Now be sure to comb your hair before you get on the stage." Well, this piece of string is just not quite long enough, or else I have a very big head. Excuse me. Okay. When I was first asked to do this debate, my first inclination was to refuse, because I felt that I would only be preaching to the converted. But then I thought, well, where we are, we're in Washington. The educational level in Washington is probably as high, if not higher, than anywhere else in the United States, and for that matter, maybe even the world. And so I thought that it would probably be worth speaking, because reason probably would prevail. And I started reading creationist literature, which I had never done before, and I found a lot of it extremely interesting. But one of the things that I found rather saddening was quite a lot of overtones which made me feel very defensive, in that as an evolutionist, my own religious persuasion is really a very, very wide open choice. The Pope, in 1950, Pope Pius XII, made an ex cathedra statement, very brief. What he said was, "The teaching of the Church leaves the doctrine of evolution an open question." In other words, Catholics are free to believe it or not as they wish. The Jesuit magazine, America, has agreed, and I quote, "The idea of evolution by now has the status not of a mere hypothesis, but of scientific fact." I think that's going too far. I don't think it's a fact. It's a very well-founded theory. But I kept coming across remarks like this. This is Judge Bracewell Dean of Atlanta. Spardo Agnew would have been proud of this alliteration. He says, "This monkey mythology of Darwin is the cause of permissiveness, promiscuity, pills, prophylactics, perversions, abortions, pornography, pollution, poisoning, and the proliferation of crimes of all types." Well, I just don't believe that's true. I'm an evolutionist. I'm not guilty of, well, many of those. And if we come a wee bit closer to home, I had a quotation by Dr. Gish, which I can't identify immediately, but paraphrasing it, he says that evolution is a cancer poisoning the minds of our youth. I think it's too bad that this kind of attitude continues, because the world, gosh, it's in bad enough trouble already. Everywhere you look, there is conflict over all manner of things. And I think that we should be allowed to live in peace. We have our own particular faiths, and I don't proselytize mine. I listen to anybody else's if they want to try and convert me, but I don't want to be accused of all those crimes, because I just don't think it's right or fair. And just to end on a nice note, Theodosius Jobjansky is probably the eminent geneticist of our day, and he, in an essay called, excuse me, I have mislaid it. How embarrassing.
Give him 30 seconds.
Well, I shan't spend any more time searching for it. The essay was called Biology Without Evolution Makes No Sense. Paraphrasing. And that is what I believe. That as a biologist, I find biology absolutely fascinating, because evolution brings together everything you see: animal behavior, survival strategies, embryology, morphology, geology, everything comes together in one harmonious whole. And any scientific theory, to be really worthy, must address all issues across the spectrum to at least a moderate extent. The distribution of plants and animals is tied into our geological history. Now we understand plate tectonics and continental drift. We know why animals and plants are where they are. Without this historical perspective, everything is just a collection of maybe curious but unrelated facts. I really urge you to look into it. I think it will enhance your lives. Thank you.